understand the point spread is 7.5, some places 8. It's a pretty big number for Georgia Tech. They're a dangerous team. They either beat you or lose badly. It's going in between. So last year the game in Atlanta was tight. It was a 4-point game until the last few minutes. So I'm a little nervous. I wish David Wilson was still here. I'd feel a lot better. Who is going to be the running back? You might know.
They have a bunch of guys playing.
I'll look it up. In other words, none of them are showing it up.
Nobody's taking care.
Yeah. One running back's good, two's better, four's bad. So we lost some people today. Must have already started to tailgate. This is an important lecture. This is a pivotal turning point lecture today. The English Civil War. The religious tensions that didn't boil over in the 16th century boil over here in the 17th, but not Catholic Protestant religious tensions. Something very different. Allow me to talk about Protestantism for a second. By the 17th century, by the 1600s, there are very few Catholics left in England. They're mainly confined to the northern counties, up in the northern part of the country. However, Protestantism is not monolithic. Far from it. You have three main strands, three main sects, if you will. The majority, most people, we can call Episcopalian. We call them Episcopalian because in Latin, the word episcopus means bishop. Part of Elizabeth's settlement in the 16th century was to retain bishops. In places that had a more thoroughgoing Reformation, like the Netherlands, like Switzerland, like parts of Germany, got rid of their bishops. They equated them with the papacy. They argued there are no bishops in the Bible, therefore there should be no bishops in Christianity. Elizabeth keeps the bishops because Elizabeth's religious settlement is a moderate, middle-of-the-road compromise between Catholicism and hardcore Protestantism. This is the majority of the population. Up in Scotland, however, you have a much more thoroughgoing Reformation, a much more radical Reformation. We call the Scots Presbyterians because the word presbyter means preacher. Scotland's church, which is amusingly called the Kirk, is governed by not bishops, as the church in England is. The church in England is a hierarchy. The Archbishop of Canterbury at the top, below him the Archbishop of York, and below him the 30 or so bishops of the 30 dioceses. In Scotland, it's a much more diffuse system of authority, where groups of preachers, or presbyters, gather together to make ecclesiastical policy. It's also much more Protestant. But there's a third strand of Protestantism in England at this point. What we often call, and their enemies called, Puritans. They themselves called themselves the godly. Very humble way to refer to yourself. They considered themselves to be true Christians. They're sometimes called independents because they advocated the abolition of an institutional church. They believed that every individual had to find their own way to God, and that the church, as it exists, is a man-made creation. These are the most radical Protestants. They're a tiny minority. They're a pretty vocal minority. These are the same people that get on a ship and end up in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620, the Pilgrims. So this is Protestantism in 17th century England. Not monolithic, cleaving into factions. And these factions will be the ones that fight the Civil War in the middle of the 17th century. Elizabeth avoided a war between Catholics and Protestants in the 16th century, but the way she avoided that was to tread that middle path, that via media, that made the extremes unhappy. And in a sense, her settlement will come back to haunt England in the 17th century. So let's start in 1603. 1603 is the year that good Queen Bess, after 45 years on the throne, finally dies. She never married. She never had any children. Her successor is her Scottish cousin, who is the King of Scotland, James Stuart, who becomes King James I and inaugurates the Stuart dynasty. The Tudors, ruling from 1485 to 1603, come to an end with the death of Henry's daughter by Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth, in 1603. James is a middle-aged man. He's been king in Scotland for over 20 years. And he has very definite ideas about kingship and politics. And in 1598, he writes a book called The True Law of Free Monarchies. And in it, he writes that the duty and allegiance that the subjects owe their king, I take out of the words of Samuel, when God had given him commandment to hear the people's voice in choosing and anointing them a king. Samuel refers to a book in the Old Testament. Another obscure book, but an important book for James. The book of 1 Samuel. In chapter 8, he finds his primary source evidence to support his thesis that God made kings, and therefore God made him king. And it's written in the 8th chapter of the book of Samuel. It came to pass, when Samuel was old, that he made his sons judges over Israel. But his sons walked not in his ways. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and said, Make us a king to judge us like all the nations. And the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people and all that they say unto thee. For they have not rejected thee, Samuel, but they have rejected me. Now show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked of him a king. And he said, This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons to make his instruments of war, and he will take your daughters to be cooks, and he will take your fields, and your vineyards, and your olive yards. And ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. For James, kingship originated with the Israelites, who requested a king, and the petulant God of the Old Testament, quick to anger and quick to jealousy, says, Fine, you want a king? I'll give you a king. The king will rob you. The king will dominate you. The king will be a tyrant. And I will not listen to your prayers because this is what you asked for. This is James's understanding of monarchy, that God made him king. However, James is a good politician. In Scotland, he had to be a good negotiator and compromiser. The Scottish throne was a weak one. And so when he gets to England, while he may believe this in his heart, in practice, he's moderate. He works with Parliament. He works to make compromises and negotiates. He doesn't rule as an absolute monarch. But in 1625 he does. And upon his death, his son, the 25-year-old bachelor Charles, becomes king. Everyone's very excited. James was not a terribly popular monarch. He was older when he came to the throne. He was this Scotsman. He was a foreigner. He didn't advocate war. In fact, he made peace with Spain, which was unpopular. And so when he dies, few tears are shed. Everyone's very excited about the young Charles. This is the first time England has had a young man on the throne since Henry VIII, over 100 years before. So everyone's very excited. But that excitement is not going to last for very long.
Charles was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey on the 2nd of February 1626. For James, divine right had been an intellectual position. For Charles, it was an emotional and religious one. This was immediately made clear by his coronation service, which, meticulously choreographed by the up-and-coming cleric William Laud, lovingly reproduced all the splendour, solemnity and sacred mysteries of the medieval Catholic rite.
Charles was treating each and every item of the regalia as a sacrament of monarchy. God was washing away the merely human in him and leaving him purely, indefeasibly and absolutely a king. Or so Charles at least thought.
Like most royal heirs, Charles defined himself by espousing policies which were the opposite of his father's. He was pro-war, but Parliament, despite its vocal enthusiasm for a Protestant crusade in Europe, was never prepared to vote enough tax to make war a serious option. Frustrated by Parliament's unwillingness to put its money where its Protestant mouth was, Charles, instead of fighting the Catholic French, married the French, and of course Catholic, Princess Henrietta Maria in 1626. On account of her religion, the marriage was extremely unpopular with Parliament. It didn't even succeed in cementing an alliance with France.
The result was that Charles soon found himself in the worst of all possible worlds, without tax, with a Catholic wife, and fighting a hopeless war against both major Catholic powers, France and Spain. Charles, looking for a scapegoat for the debacle, found it in what he saw as Parliament's sullen obstructiveness. Charles decided that Parliaments were more trouble than they were worth, and that, in future, he would rule without them.
All over Europe, monarchs were dispensing with parliaments. So, in attempting personal rule, Charles was simply following the European trend. But, unlike his European counterparts, Charles lacked the legal ability to tax his subjects at will. Only a parliament could legislate new taxes. So, like his father before him, Charles's only recourse was to squeeze more revenue out of his customary rights and prerogatives. Fortunately, he got a crack team of lawyers to help him. The most ingenious was the Attorney General, William Noy.
Ship money was a traditional levy imposed on port towns to raise vessels for the navy in time of war, as, for example, against the Spanish Armada in the heyday of Elizabethan England. This was uncontroversial, even popular. But Attorney General Noy said that the law allowed the king to extend ship money from the ports to the inland counties and to impose it in peacetime as well as during war. All this at the king's mere say-so.
So let's review what David Starkey had to say in that clip there. Charles's father, author of The True Law of Free Monarchies, important piece of primary source evidence, believed in divine kingship but didn't practice. Good politician. His son, quite different, believes that whatever he wants to do, he can do because he is king. This will lead him to a disastrous matrimonial choice, marrying a French Catholic woman, Henriette Marie. The English hate the French. They hate the French to this day. They certainly hate the French in the 17th century. They also hate Catholics. So this is a bad, bad decision. It would be like John F. Kennedy married a Soviet woman in 1959. It would be immensely unpopular. And this was a very unpopular match. 3 years later, he dismisses Parliament. They are combative, they are obstructive, and he decides, I no longer need you, go home. This is all well and good, but only Parliament can grant taxes. Charles has a fiscal problem on his hands. He's a very poor monarch. And so he turns to his Attorney General, William Noy, to find a solution. Noy liberally interprets the statute known as ship money, designed to be collected in time of war in port cities. Noy says, no, actually, the way I read the statute, we can collect this tax in time of peace and over the entire country. A backdoor to taxation, circumventing Parliament's control of taxation. Deeply unpopular move, but a necessary move on Charles' part because he needs cash. He is very poor. Finally, in matters of religion, he and his Archbishop, William Laud, who had crowned him in Westminster in 1625, begin to innovate and renovate. In places like Switzerland and the Netherlands, hardcore Protestant strongholds, the churches have no images. They have no paintings. They have no statues. They're regarded as idolaters by hardcore Protestants. They believe that the second commandment, that to create no graven image, should be taken literally. In England, here, under Charles, William Laud begins to reintroduce what he calls the beauty of holiness, to reintroduce ceremony, to reintroduce fancy vestments for the clergy, to reintroduce the bells and smells that are reminiscent of Catholicism. This, for the hardcore Protestants, the Puritans, and in Scotland, the Presbyterians, smacks of a backdoor to Catholicism. After all, Charles's wife is Catholic.
Under the formal rules of the Church of England, much of the country had seen the development of a stripped-down, fundamentalist Protestantism, very little different in practice from the Scottish Kirk.
But a richer, more ceremonious vision had been preserved in a handful of places, in particular in the chapels royal and the greater cathedrals. Here there were choirs, organs and music, candles and gold and silver plate on the communion tables, and rich vestments for the clergy.
William Laud, now Charles's Archbishop of Canterbury, determined to use the royal supremacy to impose this opulent religious tradition on the whole country. In England, the policy, despite some foot-dragging and protest, aroused little overt resistance. Indeed, many welcomed it. Emboldened, Charles and Laud decided that it should be extended to Scotland as well. Here, the Reformation had been far more thoroughgoing and radical, and the risks of change were correspondingly greater. But Charles, confident as ever in his God-given rightness, was undeterred. He decided that a barely modified version of the English prayer book should be used throughout Scotland.
On Sunday, the 28th of July, 1637, the new prayer book was used for the first time here in St. Giles's Cathedral in Edinburgh, in the presence of the assembled Privy Council of Scotland. But as soon as the Dean had begun the service, a great shout erupted from the crowds at the back of the church. Heavy clasped Bibles and folding stools were hurled at the councillors and the clergy, and the rioters were only ejected from the church with difficulty by the guards. And even outside, they continued pounding on the doors and pelting the windows until the service was finished. Then the protest turned political, and here in Greyfriars Kirk in Edinburgh, an influential group of citizens and noblemen drew up and signed an undertaking to resist Charles and the innovations and evils he'd introduced into the Kirk. Borrowing the name from God's solemn compact with the Jews in the Old Testament, the undertaking was known as the Covenant, and its adherents were called Covenanters. The scene at Greyfriars was repeated in churches all over the lowlands. It was now the Covenanters, not Charles, who controlled Scotland. By 1640, Charles's religious policies had brought about a crisis throughout Britain. Scotland was in the hands of the Covenanters, whilst in England, Charles's opponents drew strength from events north of the border.
So Charles, apolitical as always, attempts to unify religion in his two kingdoms. Scotland, a Presbyterian, Protestant country, resists forcefully and goes into full rebellion. The covenant is signed in church after church after church, and the Covenanters, by 1638-39, are in control of the country. Charles no longer has control of one of his kingdoms. And so he faces a dilemma. He needs an army, but he has no money. So in 1640, he will recall Parliament and ask for the money to put down the Scots rebellion.
Recall Parliament after 11 years, which brought things to a head. Charles had no choice, since only Parliament could vote the money needed to suppress the Covenanters. But equally, Parliament proved an unrivalled forum for the king's opponents. The most dangerous of these was the hitherto obscure lawyer and MP for Tavistock, John Pym. Pym believed that Charles's policies in church and state were the result of a Catholic conspiracy. But instead of wasting his time in fruitless opposition, he'd used the 11 years without a parliament to build up a compelling dossier for his case. The result was that when Charles was forced to recall Parliament, Pym was the best informed and the best prepared man in the House, ready with both a rhetoric of opposition to Charles's government and a plan of action for curbing royal power. Charles hoped to prey on English xenophobia to persuade Parliament to impose an immediate vast tax to crush the traitorous Scots. Pym countered by dragging up his list of political and religious grievances against Charles's government of the 1630s. Charles then tried to break the deadlock by hinting at the surrender of ship money, but the hint only emboldened Pym. Finally, Charles lost patience with a parliament which had, once again, failed to deliver, and dissolved it after less than a month. He would fight the Scots without a parliamentary grant. It was a catastrophic decision. In August 1640, the Scots army, large, well-disciplined, well-armed and well-provisioned, slipped past the heavily fortified English border fortress at Berwick and crossed the River Tweed. From there they moved on to Newcastle, where the Scots won one of their greatest and most momentous victories over the English. With the Scottish army encamped on English soil, Charles was forced to call Parliament again. Once again, Charles faced Pym. Pym cleverly focused on the financial and constitutional grievances against Charles.
Here, Parliament was united in its opposition, and Charles was forced into a wholesale surrender of ship money and the rest. Events in England also seem to be moving in Charles's direction. For, with Charles's surrender of ship money and the like, the religious divisions of the Commons between Puritans, like Pym, and those known as Episcopalians, who were sympathetic to Charles's ceremonious religion, were opening up. Pym tried to whip his troops into line by forcing the Grand Remonstrants to the vote. This was a searing condemnation of Charles's policies in state and especially in church. The remonstrance was normally addressed to the king, but in fact it was a manifesto for a constitutional revolution at least, perhaps even for an armed revolt. The remonstrance was also bitterly divisive, and after days of acrimonious debate, it was only passed by 159 votes to 148, a bare majority of women.
John Pym becomes the leader of Parliament here, the main voice of opposition against Charles. In December 1641, forces through a controversial measure, the Grand Remonstrance, divides Parliament as it had not been divided before. It's a document that has some echoes in the Declaration of Independence, because most of the Declaration of Independence, as we're going to see later on in this series of lectures, is mainly a laundry list of the things the king has done. And that's what the Grand Remonstrance is. Ship money, the beauty of holiness, and a whole laundry list of things that the king has done wrong. Pym's majority here in Parliament is very slim in December 1641. The traditionalists, the people who are basically content with the religious system and the increased ceremony in the church service in England, vote against this measure. They're not willing to so openly condemn their king. These are monarchists. But then Charles, in typical fashion, makes a catastrophic decision just a few weeks later. In January, on the 4th, 1642, Charles invades Parliament.
The broad-based opposition to Charles had broken up, and the more Pym pushed the Puritan attack on Charles's church, the more his majority risked disappearing entirely. But then Charles overreached himself, convinced, probably correctly, that amongst members of Parliament were traitors who colluded with the invading Scots. Charles determined to bring 5 members of Parliament, including Pym, to trial on charges of high treason. The 4th of January 1642, King Charles strode into the chamber of the House of Commons to arrest his principal opponents. His guards stood outside, fingering their weapons, as, in an uneasy silence, the king sat himself in the Speaker's chair. "Where are the 5 members?" the king demanded, calling them by name. In response, the Speaker fell on his knees, protesting that he could answer only as the House directed him. In fact, the 5 members, forewarned of the king's movements, had made good their escape by boat from the back of the Palace of Westminster, as Charles and his guards had entered on the landward side at the front. Instead, it was Charles himself who had walked into a trap. By trying to seize the 5 members by force, he'd shown himself to be a violent tyrant. By failing, he'd revealed himself to be impotent.
What had been a divided Parliament, Pym's Grand Remonstrance, had been bitterly divisive. becomes a unified parliament in the face of Charles's quote-unquote invasion here on the 4th of January, 1642. It's a radical move, and it paints him even to his nominal supporters as a tyrant, willing to ignore the rule of law, ignore the sanctity of the parliamentary chamber, and enforce his will at the point of the gun. Within a couple of months, Charles has fled the capital, has retreated to the royalist stronghold of Oxford, and raises the royal standard, calling to arms an army that he wants to use against his parliament. Parliament, in turn, will begin to raise an army, and the Civil War is on.
England, 1644. For 2 years, the country had been embroiled in a bloody civil war. But after a dozen battles and thousands dead, the war had bogged down. For the parliamentarians, the stalemate provoked crisis and soul-searching. Matters came to a head when 2 leading parliamentary generals, Edward Montagu, Earl of Manchester, and his up-and-coming deputy, Oliver Cromwell, each sought to have the other dismissed, for they differed irreconcilably about tactics, war aims, and above all, about religion. Manchester reflected the views of the majority religious faction in Parliament, the Presbyterians. They wanted a church stripped of Charles's ceremonies, which they hated as popish, and ruled not by bishops under the king, but by assemblies of clergy, known as presbyteries.
The Scottish system of Protestantism becomes very popular during the war, especially in the parliamentary ranks. The traditionalists, the Episcopalians, mainly side with the king, though there are exceptions to both rules. We have a religious war as much as a civil war, a sectarian religious war between different Protestant factions. Montagu is a Presbyterian. He wants to see the bishops abolished and essentially the Scottish kirk imported into England.
But there was another, even more radical position. These men, and women too, since religion was one of the few areas of public policy where women were free to express themselves, rejected all human authority in religion and all fixed outward forms of worship. Instead, they believed in their Christian liberty in association only with other like-minded individuals to seek after truth and to follow the Holy Spirit wherever it led them, personally and individually. Hence the various names by which they were known: independents, separatists, seekers. And one such seeker was Oliver Cromwell himself.
These are the so-called Puritans. Puritan is a derogatory term used by their enemy because the Puritans are very puritanical. They don't believe in dancing, they don't believe in gambling, they don't believe in drinking, they don't believe in alcohol. Those are all things the English like to do, especially the gambling and the drinking. And Oliver Cromwell is one of these independents, seekers, i.e. the Puritans, the most hardcore of the Protestants.
Like many religious men, Cromwell experienced a crisis of faith in his 30s, from which he emerged with a burning confidence in his own salvation.
Cromwell was a man waiting for God to reveal himself to him in action.
And what God revealed in Cromwell's own astonishing transformation from country squire to brilliant general was that Charles must be defeated and forced to accept Parliament's terms. Cromwell insinuated Manchester's belief in a negotiated settlement had led him to pull his punches on the battlefield. But Cromwell went further, Not only must parliamentary generals be imbued with a new will to victory, there must also be a fundamental reform of the existing parliamentary forces. Cromwell's arguments carried the day, and the result was the creation in February 1645 of the new model army.
Oliver Cromwell is a towering figure in English history, a controversial figure, beloved by some, hated by others. We're not going to see the last of Oliver Cromwell with this lecture. Will play a massive role over the next 2 lectures, in fact. But we first meet him here as the creator of the uncreatively named New Model Army. This New Model Army will definitively defeat King Charles and his forces in 1645 at a place called Naseby. Charles will flee to the Isle of Wight, his army crushed, and he will eventually be captured. This New Model Army is successful for 3 reasons. First, it is a highly disciplined and drilled military force. Before the New Model Army, most armies were little more than drunken mobs with weapons. What Cromwell does with the New Model Army is, on a daily basis, drill, train. The fundamentals of the American military are alive and well here with the New Model Army. Number 2, armies before Cromwell's New Model Army had taken their officers from the nobility. You were born into the officer corps. Now, sometimes that meant you were a good officer. Oftentimes it meant you weren't a very good officer. But your birth was your right to control troops. Cromwell says that no, ability must be the guiding principle for the officers. And so, what seems like a kind of no-brainer from a modern perspective is a radical departure in command and control. The New Model Army's officer corps is going to be built up from men who are good at being soldiers. Shocking, but a massive change. And number 3, this army will be overwhelmingly staffed by people like Cromwell, quote-unquote Puritans. And they believe they have a mission from God to destroy the popish tyrant Charles and restore England to its rightful place as a truly Protestant nation. So they are highly religiously motivated. They march into battle with banners like these depicted here. God is our strength. In God we trust. This New Model Army will play a major role in English politics moving forward, as we're going to see in the next lecture. But what I'd like to do before we end here is introduce some primary source evidence. Some songs, some ballads, sung around royalist campfires. The royalists are known as cavaliers, from the French word chevalier, which means knight. Because, although there are exceptions to this rule, much of Charles' military is of noble birth. The mascot of the University of Virginia is the Cavalier because the colony of Virginia during the Civil War remained loyal to the crown. Thus, the ridiculous Cavalier mascot. With, as I noticed in going over this lecture, a nice six-pack on him. So I'm going to show you 3 of these ballads. Imagine them being sung around the campfire in the Cavalier Royalist camps. The first one comes from 1642, when the king comes home in peace again. The Parliament must willing be that all the world may plainly see how they do labor still for peace, that now these bloody wars may cease. For they will gladly spend their lives to defend the king in all his right to reign. So then I can tell all things will be well when we enjoy sweet peace again. An optimistic ballad from the first year of the war. But as we move into the third year of the war, fourth year of the war actually, 1645, we have I love my king and country well. I love the king and the parliament, but I love them both together. And when they by division asunder are rent, I know 'tis good for neither. Whichsoe'er of these be victorious, I'm sure for us no good 'twill be, for our plagues will increase unless we have peace, and the king and his realms agree. And finally, a recognition that the war is lost with 1645's The Commoners. 'Tis too late to tread these usurpers under. First down goes the crown, then follows the gown. Gown is a reference to the clergy. Cromwell and his new model army wanted to do away with the established church, that every man and woman had to find their own way to God. Thus leveled are we by the Roundhead. Roundhead is a derogatory term that the Royalists have for their parliamentary foes. The Royalists, by and large, had long hair. It was the fashion of the day. Charles had long hair. All the nobility had long hair. Roundhead refers to the short haircuts of the parliamentary forces, most of whom were what we call working class, and for whom long hair was not practical. Thus leveled are we by the Roundhead. Well, church and state must feed their pride and lust, and the kingdom and king be confounded. Interesting primary source evidence in these ballads written by royalists, mournful here in 45, as it's recognized that in fact the war is lost. So we've covered a lot of ground today. We began with the ascension of James Stuart to the throne in 1603. James, the author of a political treatise that argued monarchy was a divine gift from God. And his primary source evidence for his treatise is the Bible, is the Old Testament, is the book of 1 Samuel chapter 8, in which the Israelites ask for and are given a king. And God tells them that, I'll give you a king, all right, ungrateful Israelites. And this king will tyrannize you, will dominate you, and you will cry out, and I won't listen to you. Because I'm an angry, vengeful, jealous God of the Old Testament. He is succeeded by his son in 1625, the young bachelor, the exciting, charismatic Charles. And everybody's very excited initially about this new king, but within months of taking the throne, he makes a massive political misstep. He marries Henriette Marie, a French Catholic woman. The English hate the French, and they hate Catholics. This is politically a very stupid thing to do, but you've got to remember, Charles doesn't think politically. God made him king, he'll do what he wants. How dare these little people question what he does? So tired is he of the little people that by 1629 he is fed up with his own parliament, sends them home, and for 11 years rules alone. His problem, though, is that Parliament is the only body in the country that can grant taxes. And so he turns to his Attorney General, William Noy. And William Noy creatively interprets the ship money statute, arguing that in actuality the king can collect ship money in times of peace, as well as times of war, and throughout the entire country, not just in the port cities. This is a massively unpopular move. taxation without representation, an argument that we will see again in the American context a century and a half later. In matters of religion, Charles is also politically tone deaf. He is a fan of ceremony. He is a fan of lavish religious ceremony. And so with his Archbishop William Laud, he begins to renovate the church service, to bring back the statues, to bring back the images, to bring back the pomp and circumstance of the old ways. Most people in England are perfectly fine with it. However, people like Cromwell, people like him, the Puritans, are horrified. They believe that Charles is actually a Catholic. After all, he married a French Catholic woman. He allows his French Catholic wife to have a priest and to celebrate the Catholic Mass. He himself may very well be a Catholic, they believe. And then the tragic misstep. The thing that will put England onto the road to civil war. Charles decides that his Scottish subjects should celebrate God in the same way as his English subjects. And so in 1637, he tries to impose on Scotland the English Book of Common Prayer. The Scots have had a much more thoroughgoing Reformation, and they are not going to take this line down. They rebel. They sign the Covenant. And by 1638-39, the Covenanters, not Charles, control Scotland. Charles is incensed. How dare his subjects rebel against him, the God-given king? He needs an army. Problem is, he can't get an army without Parliament. So, reluctantly, in 1640, he recalls Parliament. After 11 long years, as David Starkey put it. Immediately, Parliament, led by John Pym, begins to complain about the last 11 years. Begins to complain about shit money. Begins to complain about Archbishop William Laud. And so after just 1 month, Charles sends them home again. This was a terrible mistake. Go home. I don't want to hear you complain anymore. This is known as the Short Parliament because it lasted only a month. Charles then decides, damn it, I'm going to go fight the Scots on my own. I don't need a parliament to help me. God made me king. I'll be successful. He's not. He's badly defeated. The Scots invade England. They capture the important northern city of Newcastle, where, of course, Newcastle beer comes from. This is a tragedy. Charles is humiliated, returns to London, and recalls Parliament for a second time. In 1640, this will become known as the Long Parliament because it will sit, as we're going to see, for a very, very long time, all the way through the 1640s. Once again, this Parliament, led by John Pym, doesn't give Charles what he wants. He wants money for an army. All the parliamentarians want to talk about are the 1630s. And in December 1641, John Pym forces through the Grand Remonstrance, a document that has echoes, as we are going to see, in the Declaration of Independence, inasmuch as it is a laundry list of things the king has done wrong. Much as the Declaration of Independence, as we are going to see, is mainly a laundry list of all the things that King George III had done wrong. However, this divides Parliament. Many of the more traditional members are not willing to so openly, publicly rebuke the king. And so it only passes by a vote of 159 to 148. Parliament is now deeply divided. They had been united in constitutional and legal opposition to Charles, but the Grand Remonstrance splits Parliament into two camps. One siding with the king, one siding with John Pym. An almost 50-50 split. But just a few weeks later, Charles screws up big time. He takes a group of soldiers and he marches into Parliament, commanding the arrest of John Pym and 4 other members on charges of high treason for colluding with the Scots. Him and the other 4 members have escaped, tipped off that Charles was coming, and Parliament is incensed that Charles would invade its sacred space. Within a couple of months, the standard is raised at Oxford, Parliament raises its own army, and we've got ourselves a civil war that will drag on for years until Oliver Cromwell revolutionizes the parliamentary military into the new model army and defeats Charles at the Battle of Naseby. But things are just getting started, because as we're going to see when we come back on Wednesday, Naseby's only the beginning of what will become a Puritan revolution led by Oliver Cromwell, that, not to give away anything, but by 1649 will result in the removal of Charles's head from his body in front of his palace of Whitehall. So you have a chapter from a book about the Puritan Revolution, creatively titled The Puritan Revolution, 1640 to 1660, by John Coffey. Will help to make sense of what's happening here in this tumultuous decade. And you have a short piece of primary source evidence I'd like you to print and bring with you, The Instrument of Government from 1653. So, enjoy the game tonight. Remember, ignite brains, plan accordingly.